I'm going to talk about Wilfrid Sellars, and I'm going to try to explain, well, in a way, there is a continuity between this, my current work on Sellars, which I hope will result in a book in about a year or so, and the book I published a decade ago. My book opens with an account of Sellars' distinction between the manifest and the scientific images of man in the world, and this provided me with the basic framework I wanted in order to formulate the problem of nihilism. After writing the book and reading more of Sellars' work, I came to realize that of all the philosophers I discussed in the book, he was the one I had, I think, whose work I had least understood, or whose work I had, skimmed over most superficially. And I realized that understanding the proper nature of his philosophical system forced me to reformulate the questions that I had tried to raise in that book. So this is why I've spent the past several years trying to understand Sellars' work. Okay, so I hope this is a kind of a justification for what for what follows. Okay, so paper's got three parts. First, I'm going to give an account of Sellars' Transcendental Naturalism. Then I'm going to discuss Robert Brandom's critique of Sellarsian naturalism. Brandom is a philosopher who's deeply influenced by Sellars. His whole inferentialist semantics was sketchily formulated in Sellars' own work. It's given a systematic articulation in Brandom's work. But Brandom rejects Sellars' commitment to naturalism and to scientific naturalism. And finally, I'll close with a kind of an account of the defend Sellars' naturalism against some of Brandom criticisms, or at least try to, and try to emphasize the importance of the distinction between practices and processes, between discursive practices and material processes, which I think underlies this whole kind of disagreement between Brandom and Sellars. Okay, so Sellars is a transcendental philosopher, and the transcendental perspective alters the conditions in terms of which the issue of realism is framed. Transcendental philosophy can be contrasted with dogmatic rationalism on the one hand and skeptical empiricism on the other. The dogmatic rationalist assumes that the mind enjoys a priori cognitive access to a mind-independent reality and believes that reason can deduce the fundamental features of that reality. The skeptical empiricist, for her part, insists that all knowledge is rooted in but limited by sensory experience and denies that reason can deliver a priori knowledge of mind-independent reality. The transcendental philosopher rejects both dogmatism and skepticism. She rejects the rationalist's assumption that the mind enjoys a priori cognitive access to reality, just as she rejects the empiricist's claim that all knowledge derives from sensory experience. Both dogmatism and empiricist skepticism remain beholden to what Sellars calls the framework of givenness. Now, Sellars is famous for his attack on the myth of the given. But this attack is misunderstood. It's often reduced to a critique of a kind of naive positivistic empiricism. And this is not the target of Sellars' critique. It's what he calls the whole framework of givenness applies both to certain kinds of rationalist metaphysics and to, so I would argue, certain kind of strains of Husserlian and post-Husserlian phenomenology. Okay? So if he rejects the framework of givenness, it's because dogmatism takes the correlation between thinking and being as given, and skepticism takes the intelligibility of sensory experience as given. At the heart of the framework of givenness is the assumption, common to empiricism and rationalism, that mental states are self-intimating. And to reject this framework is to refuse the assumption that the mental is self-intimating. This means that minds do not necessarily know themselves. There is a fundamental difference between thinking and knowing what one is thinking of. By the same token, there's a fundamental difference between sensing and knowing what is sensed. The awareness of something is not the awareness of something as something. And this difference between thinking and thought or sensing and sense follows from the rejection of the framework of givenness. I think it is the transcendental difference for Sellars. He recasted the transcendental difference as obtaining between thinking and thought, or sensing and sense. The core feature of the framework of givenness is the premise that the fusion of thinking and thought, or of sensing and sense, is guaranteed, either by intellectual intuition, in the case of rationalism, or sensory intuition, in the case of empiricism. But this intuitive identity, whether intellectual or sensory, immediately generates metaphysical divisions, such as between mind and nature, experience and theory, immediacy and mediation, etc. The rejection of this fusion raises the spectre of representation, since thinking stands to thought and sensing stands to sensed, as representing stands to represented. And notwithstanding all the critiques of representation in 20th century philosophy, specifically those of Heidegger and Deleuze, I think Sellars' account of representation circumvents both those critiques. This is not a Cartesian conception of representation. It's a radicalized Kantian account. The transcendental question then becomes, what is the nature of the connection between thinking and thought, or sensing and sense? Or more generally, how are we to understand the connection between representing and represented? The problem of representation arises from the rejection of metaphysical fusion, whether of thinking and thought or sensing and sense. But it is not the problem of the division of substance, the one and the many, or of the connection between divided substances, whether thinking or extended, animate or inanimate. The problem of representation is not the problem of how a thinking substance can somehow, reach out into extended substance and retrieve a representation of an object, or of some features or characteristics of extended substances. It is the problem of representation is the problem of the transcendental torsion between the represented inside and the representing outside. It's a problem of transcendental exteriority. And this torsion is the focus of what Sellars calls transcendental logic, which precisely suspends the metaphysical reification of the difference between mind and nature. Here's a quote from Sellars' 1966 paper, Some Remarks on Kant's Theory of Experience. The task of transcendental logic is to explicate the concept of a mind that gains knowledge of the world of which it is a part. The acquisition of knowledge by such a mind involves its being acted on or affected by the objects it knows. Rejecting the framework of givenness means relinquishing the assumption of a resemblance between the categories of thought, the structure of representing, and the order of nature. Our understanding of nature is discursive, not intuitive. This is Sellars' Kantianism. In other words, because it's discursive, it represents nature. But this representation of nature, minimally defined as a spatio-temporal continuum, and I know that there's a whole problem about how successfully one can avoid smuggling in metaphysical assumptions into any kind of characterization of nature. But nevertheless, let's try and stick to a kind of a minimal definition. As a spatio-temporal continuum is conditioned by the way nature appears to us, both spatially and temporally. And since what is empirical is coextensive with spatio-temporal appearance, nature is cognizable to the extent that it is empirically representable. But, says Sellars, not every system of empirical representables constitutes nature, but only that system of empirical representables, the representings of which would be true. Transcendental logic then aims to uncover both what it is for something to be an empirical representable and what it is for something to be a true representing. Understanding the former involves grasping the way in which thinking interacts with sensing, while understanding the latter requires grasping the nature of the connection between truth pertaining to what is conceptually represented and truth pertaining to non-conceptual representing. So we need this distinction between truth at the level of the represented and truth at the level of representing. No single account of truth can, the mistake is to kind of to focus on one at the expense of the other. So this is distinction between representing and represented is not the difference between two separate things, but the formal distinction between, let's say, act and content. And this yields the distinction between objective reality, reality immanent to the represented, and what can be called reality in itself, i.e. non-represented reality. But non-represented does not mean non-representable. The distinction between objective or represented reality and non-represented reality, or reality in itself, is epistemological and not ontological. So this distinction between represented and non-represented, or between what is for us and in itself, is contained within the immanent distinction between representing and represented. And the relation of analytical dependence between represented and representing renders the objective reality of the represented content conditional upon the formal reality of the representing act. Now here, Sellars is basically drawing on what he thinks is the scholastic distinction which underwrites Kant's distinction between appearance and in itself. In other words, the objective reality is reality as the correlate of some kind of mental act, whereas the formal reality is substantial reality. It's independent. It's the reality that substantial form has. Since every represented implies a representing, the objective reality of a represented entails the formal reality of the representing through which it is represented. Now, this argument establishes only that if there are representeds, then there must be representings in themselves. Not that there actually are such representings in themselves, or that we can know either them or non-representings in themselves, because there are also non-representings in themselves. Transcendental skepticism insists on the possibility of a complete disconnection between represented contents and the in itself, whether construed in terms of representings or non-representings. And Sellars now, I think, has two arguments. I'm summarizing, but I think he has two basic arguments against transcendental skepticism. First, we can question the truth of some of our beliefs, or we can question the kind of the adequacy of some representatives by holding others to be true, but we cannot question the truth of all our beliefs at once. What cannot be represented is the falsity of every represented. This is Sellers's, in other words, that Sellars, I think, most powerful argument against a kind of radical skepticism is that it appeals to, it has to appeal to a kind of a version of the myth of the given where you can somehow imagine the possibility of appearances. You can imagine the intelligibility of appearances that have no objective correlates. For Sellars, this supposes the appeal to a fundamental stratum of appearance, uncontaminated by any taking of appearances to be thus and so, an account of seeming uncontaminated by any claim that something seems, or a represented that is not of something, or of something as something. And I think the Sellarsian claim is that no such stratum of appearance is even conceivable, because the appearing is always the appearing of something. The second strand in his argument against transcendental skepticism is the argument from what Sellars calls double affection. Okay, and this is the one I'm going to focus on. And Sellars' proposal is that the transcendental exteriority of things in themselves as grounds of appearances has an analogue in the empirical exteriority of physical objects as causes of sensations. And here's a quote from Sellars where he sets out his strategy, which is the analogical reclamation of the in itself. Sellars writes in Science and Metaphysics from 1967, even if we attribute to Kant the view that things in themselves are analogous in structure to the world of appearance, the analogy would for him be one which could only be cached by God, much as, according to traditional theology, only he can cache the analogies in terms of which we attempt to conceive him. God would have a non-analogical grasp of things in themselves by virtue of the fact that his intuitive representations are not passive, but are the very volitions by which they are created. It's precisely God's intellectual intuition creates or generates the objects which it intuits, which is why the distinction between particular and universal doesn't exist for him. He can grasp everything in its infinite complexity. But Sellars continues, the thesis I wish to defend, but not ascribe to Kant, is that although the world we conceptually represent in experience exists only in actual and obtainable representings of it, we can say, from a transcendental point of view, not only that existence in itself accounts for this obtainability by virtue of having a certain analogy with the world we represent, but also that in principle, we, rather than God alone, can provide the cache. For as I see it, the use of analogy in theoretical science, unlike that in theology, generates new determinate concepts. It does not merely indirectly specify certain unknown attributes by an analogy of proportion. One might put this by saying that the conceptual structures of theoretical science give us new ways of schematizing categories. So, we supply the conceptual currency for constructing the analogy between the determinations of appearances and the determinations of the in itself. And this construction is the analogical schematization through which non-representings in themselves can account for the obtainability of conceptual representings. This obtainability, I think, is the key term for Sellars. So how might such schematization proceed? Things in themselves are not the causes of appearances in the sense in which electrostatic discharges are the causes of lightning. And this is not because the category of causation cannot be applied to things in themselves. It can, provided we bear in mind the distinction between pure and schematized categories. The pure or unschematized category of causation is the logical relation of ground and consequence. And as such, it can be applied to the relation between appearances and things in themselves, so long as we are clear that this is a strictly conceptual rather than a cognitive determination. Thus, we can think things in themselves as the grounds of appearances, provided that this grounding relation is understood in terms of a modified analogy with the way in which appearances cause other appearances. And the relevant modification is that whereas a schematized category of causality always involves a consequence relation between temporal events, the grounding relation between things in themselves and appearances involves a consequence relation that operates at the level of transcendental reflection. So, the postulate of the thing in itself is a transcendental and hence purely conceptual analog of the causal relation between material objects and sensations. And this is a quote from Kant now. Even if we cannot cognize these same objects, appearances, as things in themselves, we must at least be able to think them as things in themselves, for otherwise they would follow the absurd proposition that there is an appearance without anything that appears. This is the point of Kant's insistence that the distinction between appearances and things in themselves, or between phenomena and noumena, is precisely not a metaphysical distinction. It's not a two-world metaphysics. He's not dividing the world into sensible objects and intelligible objects. Things in themselves are the same things as appearances, but considered independently of the way in which they affect us. Now, Sellars' break with Kant is over the constraint that sensibility exercises over understanding, and hence the relation that thinking bears to knowing. For Kant, conceptual cognition is constrained by sensible intuition. Concepts without intuitions are empty. They have no cognitive content. We can think but cannot know things in themselves. But where Sellars parts company with Kant is that he thinks that Kant conflates the manifold of intuition with the manifold of sense. By distinguishing them, we can conceive of the grounding relation between appearances and things in themselves as analogous to the relation between conceptual representeds and non-conceptual representings. Now, so the distinction is going to be, so Sellars is going to say that Sellars wants to distinguish between intuition and sensation. And he wants to say that space and time are conceptually intuited, okay, but so that the understanding, the synthesis of apprehension, is already at work in sensibility. It forms the kind of the manifold of sense into this suches, into particular objects, of which can then be conceptually characterized in other ways. That's conceptual intuition, whereas there's a non-conceptual representing which operates at the level of sensation. Okay, so the distinction is between conceptual representing, which is intuitive, which can be intuitive, and non-conceptual representing, which is not intuitive. So the manifold of sense comprises complexes of representations that are also representations of complexes, but the representing of complexity does not simply mirror the complexity of the representing. For example, a representing of a green square adjoining a red square need not be understood as comprising a representing of a green square, a representing of a red square, and a representing of the relation of adjoining. Just as from the expression a cat and a mat, we can form the complex common noun cat on a mat, which occurs in the sentence, this is a cat on a mat. So this is now an object, a cat on a mat. So from any expressions, a kind one and a kind two, we can form the complex common noun, a kind one related to a kind two, or conjoined with a kind two. The expression a kind one conjoined with a kind two is an instance of the same general form as that exemplified by the expression cat on a mat. But since this also has the same general form as the expression cat, then so does a K1 or a K2. So this is not a propositional expression of the form X or Y. In other words, this is not a relation between objects. A representing of a green square need not comprise anything green or square. Its structure does not mirror the structure of what it represents. And this feature can be noted by characterizing it as an of a green square representing. Thus, the representing of a green square adjoining a red square can be expressed as an of a green square adjoining a red square representing, or as a green square adjoining a red square representing. In other words, this is Sellars' adverbial account of sensing, where sensation doesn't involve a relationship between sensing and sensed, where the sense is some kind of object, but rather it's a non-relational representing, which can be adverbially characterized through these kinds of locutions. And the philosophical point being made here is that the representing of complexity is correlated with a complexity of representing via what Sellars calls counterpart relations between representing and represented. But there is no resemblance between the complexity of the representing and the representing of complexity. So this is Sellars' hypothesis. All the possible ways in which conceptual representings of empirical properties and relations can resemble and differ correspond to ways in which what he calls their immediate non-conceptual occasions, i.e. non-conceptual representings of sense, can resemble and differ. So we explain how non-conceptual representings constrain conceptual representings by postulating a correspondence relation between two distinct systems of resemblances and differences, one conceptual, the other non-conceptual. And Sellars calls the latter sense impressions. Now, This correspondence does not require a resemblance relation between items in the two systems. The correspondence is what Sellars calls a second-order isomorphism between non-resembling systems of resemblances and differences. And nor, of course, does it consist of a relation of resemblance between representation and represented. The conceptual system does not represent the non-conceptual system. The correspondence consists in the structural equivalence between properties of relations among two distinct sets of relations. So, this then provides the framework for analogical theorizing. Just as the characteristics of non-conceptual representings cannot be construed as resembling what is conceptually represented through them, so the characteristics of sense impressions cannot be identified with those of their typical causes. These characteristics must be understood as new theoretical predicates introduced by analogy with those of certain observables. Now, although modeled upon the properties of represented physical observables, the properties of sense impressions are not physical properties or states. So once we reject the claim that the representation of something is the representation of it as something that it is, and see that all representing of something as something is conceptual, the way is open to viewing the distinction between the observable and the unobservable, which is, or let's say, the theoretical, as methodological and not ontological, and postulating theoretical entities to explain conceptually characterized appearances establishes this, the sought-for analogy at the level of transcendental reflection between observables and postulates on one hand, and appearances and things in themselves on the other. Now this, Sellars' arguments, which is the elaboration of Sellars' argument from double affection, allows us to accept Kant's rejection of dogmatic rationalism and skeptical empiricism while avoiding his idealism. Here's another quote from Sellars. Indeed, it is only if Kant distinguishes the radically non-conceptual character of sense from the conceptual character of the synthesis of apprehension and intuition, and accordingly, the receptivity of sense from the guidedness of intuition, that he can avoid the dialectic which leads from Hegel's phenomenology to 19th century idealism. Okay. So,
10 minutes, c'est long, t'inquiète pas.
I'll move now to Sellars' scientific realism. Okay, so this is the condition for reconciling transcendental logic, understood as an account of how non-conceptual reality constrains the structure of its own conceptual representation, with naturalism understood as the claim that representings are a part of nature, minimally defined as a spatio-temporal continuum. So Sellars writes, as I see it, a consistent scientific realist must hold that the world of everyday experience is a phenomenal world in the Kantian sense, existing only as the contents of actual and obtainable conceptual representings, the obtainability of which is explained not, as for Kant, by things in themselves, known only to God, but by scientific objects, about which, barring catastrophe, we shall know more and more as the years go by. So, this realism is an explanatory hypothesis about the obtainability of conceptual representings. It requires a metaphysical postulate, where metaphysical means identifying the proper functioning of categories, understood as conceptual summa genera, and when necessary, recategorizing phenomena to explain the obtainability of conceptual representings. And the postulate of sense impressions is metaphysical in this sense. They're not microphysical entities, but recategorizations of the sensible qualities of macrophysical objects. I'll skip over this the distinction between two senses of physical to get to Sellars' naturalism. So Sellars' naturalism is not Aristotelian, where nature is a repository of substantial forms. It's not simply methodological, in the sense where methodological naturalism is where the claim that the bounds of the natural are delimited by the explanatory resources of current science, but nor is it reductive, where every natural phenomenon must be decomposable into its microphysical components. Now, here we get to Brandom's critique of Sellars' naturalism. Brandom's claim is that despite his Kantianism, Sellars' scientific realism turns out to be a brand of reductive naturalism, contradicted by the anti-reductive consequences of Sellars' modal expressivism. And what is this? This is the thesis that, I won't read out the quote here, but it's simply the claim that alethic modal concepts like necessity and possibility express lawful relations between empirical descriptive concepts, such as house, cat, opera, electron. And what they express are the structural framework features conditioning the deployment of empirical concepts. So for Brandom, following Sellars, the deployment of any empirical descriptive concept presupposes knowing how to deploy these alethic modal concepts. Modal vocabulary allows us to say what we are doing when we use descriptive vocabulary. It explains why describing something as A entails describing it as B. Modal assertions provide inference tickets from one empirical characterization to another. So, to say dogs are necessarily mammals is to say that one is justified in moving from the claim, this is a dog, to this is a mammal. And this is why there's a kind of an intimate connection between describing and explaining. Describing and explaining are distinguishable but inseparable, says Sellars. So that describing and explaining things always goes hand in hand. To explain means to understand the modal properties or the modal characteristics of any empirical entity. It's part of the condition of being able to properly classify or properly describe an entity, that we understand, its modal features, what it can and cannot do. So here's what Brandom calls the modal Kant-Sellars thesis. Modal vocabulary renders explicit features that are implicit in the use of all ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary. Every empirical descriptive concept has modal consequences. The necessary conditions for its correct application are rendered explicit using subjunctive conditions. For example, the conditions for the correct application of the empirical descriptive concept organism are rendered explicit in subjunctive conditionals such as, if this organism were to ingest a toxic substance, it would be harmed. But these inferences are non-monotonic. They are not robust under arbitrary addition of auxiliary premises. In other words, if the organism's been given an antidote to the poison, it will not be harmed. Okay, so now we come to, have I still got 5 minutes left?
Yes.
Okay, so what I'll do is I'll simply explain Brandom's critique of Sellars' naturalism, or why he thinks, and then maybe kind of elaborate what is misguided about this critique in the discussion, okay? So Brandom's argument is as follows. Since descriptive properties, empirical descriptive properties, are modally involved, they locate objects in a space of implication. The identification of an object A with another object B requires identifying all of A's empirical descriptive properties with those of B. But this includes modal properties, because all of A's modal properties, i.e. the subjunctive conditionals that are true of it, must be identical with all of B's modal properties, all the subjunctive conditionals that are true of B. Now, among empirical descriptive properties are sortal predicates: lion, house, person, molecule. A sortal being any kind of noun which can be counted. Okay? You can count lions, houses, persons, molecules, etc. Sortals determine criteria of identity and individuation. Different sortals can have the same criteria of identity and individuation, e.g. the sortals kitten and cat, different criteria of application but not criteria of identity. All kittens are cats, but all cats have been kittens, so the kitten then becomes a phase sortal of cats. However, there are different sortals, such as passenger and person, which have distinct criteria of application and identity. The number of passengers counted by airlines is not the same as the number of persons taking flights. The same person making a round-trip flight counts as two different passengers for the airline. If one tallies up passengers in terms of flights, there will be more passengers than persons, even if every passenger on every flight is a person. Identifying person A with passenger 1 is a strongly cross-sortal identity because it requires identifying all of A's modal properties with all of B's. But if person A had not taken a flight, he would not be passenger 1, but still be person A. So, Brandom concludes, person A and passenger 1 differ in at least one modal property. So, since manifest object and scientific objects fall under different descriptive sortals with different criteria of identity and individuation, identifying them would require what Brandom calls strongly cross-sortal identities. But such sortals differ in the non-monotonic subjunctive conditionals that govern their application, and therefore the identification must fail. Strongly cross-sortal identity claims, says Brandom, are never true. According to Brandom, Sellars' claim is that our everyday descriptions of things, cats, persons, passengers, is explained by postulating non-conceptual complexes of representations. And according to Brandom, this explanation requires identifying the properties of conceptually represented contents with those of non-conceptual representings. Since such identification is impossible, the requirement of explanation is in this instance misguided. It is a symptom of what Brandom calls object naturalism. Object naturalism seeks to locate the truth makers of claims in a target discourse in the world as specified by a favor naturalistic vocabulary, whether physics or some other science. So object naturalism is a naturalism about objects and properties that our vocabulary allows us to think and talk about. By way of contrast, subject naturalism is a pragmatic naturalism that's simply wants to give an account of the discursive practices of using the target vocabulary as meaningful in the way in which it is meaningful. And this, according to Brandom, requires seeking what he calls a pragmatic meta-vocabulary for every target, for every kind of, every vocabulary containing empirical descriptive claims, okay? So now, okay, I'll just simply summarize the third and final section, why I think Brandom, two things. Brandom thinks that the ability to deploy empirical descriptive terms, and therefore to master the relevant subjunctive conditionals, involves what he calls systems of pragmatic inference. Pragmatic inference is knowing how to use, knowing what to do to deploy an empirical concepts appropriately. Pragmatic inference is precisely what is captured in what he calls a pragmatic metavocabulary. The pragmatic metavocabulary it specifies what one is doing, says what one is doing when employing an empirical descriptive vocabulary. But according to Brandom, this is precisely, it's this, the characterization of what one is doing is precisely what cannot be explained in terms of any kind of discourse that is entirely, that would objectify what is going on in this doing. So in other words, what Brandom is saying is that pragmatic meta-vocabulary explicates a descriptive vocabulary as meaningful in the way in which it is meaningful. And thereby it immunizes, and this insistence that a vocabulary can only be explained in its own terms, where, so any kind of saying can only be explained by rendering explicit what one is doing when one is saying something. This means that pragmatic inference, the practice of pragmatic inference, or the competence involved in pragmatic inference, is immunized against any kind of objectivation or any kind of scientific explanation or any kind of theoretical explanation that simply doesn't explicate the relationship between the competence at the level of description and the competence at the level of categorization. Okay? So my final claim is this, is that Sellars' naturalism is actually not about trying to characterize discursive competences in terms of the object categories proper to the scientific image. It's a claim that in order to understand that our discursive competences are tied to the world through our sensible capacities, so that all conceptual representing is guided by non-conceptual representing. And the claim is this relationship, the constraint that the non-conceptual exercises over the conceptual is precisely what philosophy must forge resources so as to forge resources that would allow it to be empirically explainable. Okay? So ultimately, the claim is that Brandom's insistence, he misconstrues Sellars as a reductive naturalism, and I think he misunderstands the most important motivation for Sellers's introduction of a metaphysics of pure processes, which is to forge a category, a conceptual category, that can explain how non-conceptual representings in themselves, together with conceptual representings, are both ingredients in a natural process. And what he calls, since processes are concrete universals, they're a new species of individuals. They are not objects, nor are they can they be explained in terms of systems of relations amongst objects. So, by trying to immunize discursive praxis from objectification, what Brandom does is he resorts to a kind of a familiar kind of hermeneutic transcendentalism, where discursive practices, the way in which we understand ourselves and the world, is, in a way, incorrigible and incorrigible in principle, because it cannot be subjected to kind of any external explanatory constraint. Okay, that's it. I'll just stop. Thanks.